G'day YouTube, Warbles on a lot here. Tony Abbott's decided to succumb to the cargo cult of building a white elephant second airport for Sydney at Badgery's Creek.
Ed Husick has warned the federal government's roads funding package won't be enough to service the second Sydney airport. The federal and New South Wales governments will spend $3.5 billion for roads in the region over the next decade. More than $1 billion will be set aside in next month's federal budget. Mr Husick has told Sky News it still isn't enough money.
That $1.3 billion that's been announced, I think, will not be adequate enough to be able to deal with putting extra passengers from that airport onto infrastructure that's already groaning under the weight of a fast-growing population in one of the fastest-growing regions in the country.
The New South Wales...
Okay, so no doubt there are some people who would quibble with my use of the term cargo cult, but that is in fact how I see it. The existing major airport at Sydney, Kingsford Smith, is built with a runway extension going out into Botany Bay. Originally it was just an open, flat, sandy patch of grass, and that's where people who lived in Sydney started flying their aeroplanes. There's another airstrip out at Bankstown. It's exclusively small general aviation. It's too hemmed in by suburbs to be able to be expanded, and you've already got people complaining about little aircraft flying low overhead. So if you go 50 kilometres west of Sydney, you come out into this patch here, and the trouble is there's no rail connection, and all the transport experts who say if you're going to have two airports you have to have a rail connection between them. And there's no money in the proposed plan for a rail connection. And there's been a couple of potential sites bruited about for 40 years that I can think of regarding this second Sydney airport. But the trouble is we're not in the 1970s or 80s or even 90s. It's 2014 and everybody with half a grip on reality understands that the world has to reduce its carbon emissions. And that means that economies are going to shrink, and that means the number of people who've got spare money to fly halfway around the world to show up 24 hours a day at Sydney's second airport is it's unlikely to materialise. Less and less people can afford to fly overseas for their holidays, and nobody with a brain sends anything by air cargo if they can possibly send it by a boat. So I would suggest that anybody who claims that air traffic arriving at Sydney is going to double in the next 10 years because it doubled in the previous 10 years is dreaming. It would be like somebody claiming the sales of kerosene lamps were going to increase at the same rate between 1900 and 1950 as they increased between 1850 and 1900. Sometimes factors change, and I believe setting aside $3 billion or $10 billion or however much it is to build an airport at Badgery's Creek in the firm, certain political conviction that if we build the airport then the aeroplanes will show up, and when the aeroplanes show up they will disgorge great quantities of wealth and riches, and thus our economy will swell and grow and we'll all be considered very clever. It's a cargo cult. Right, now if we're going to talk cargo cults we have to change maps, and we have to actually look backwards in time. Cargo cults got their start during the Second World War with American and Australian army operations in New Guinea, which is a place still considered so remote that even the Reader's Digest World Atlas has trouble depicting it. So I propose to go back to a period source, 1943 first edition khaki and green. Once upon a time, Papua New Guinea was under white Australian colonial administration. It was a territory, a protectorate, and it was all very pucker sahib, with little colonies of whitefellas on the outside coastal fringe, and the interior was jungle, with footbridges and walking paths if you were really lucky. And during the 1930s there was some early air cargo transport went on, supplying equipment to gold miners in the highlands in New Guinea. But then World War II came along, and as the Australian military came ashore, carrying everything that they could possibly load themselves up with, pretty quickly the natives were enrolled as stretcher bearers with the Australian Army, Fuzzy Wuzzy Angels as they were known at the time, as well as porters hand carrying supplies across really rugged terrain, which reduced the Australians and the Americans to going back to using pack horses. So they started supplying troops by air. The bully beef bomber was invented, as they called it. Sometimes it was extremely low tech, dropping supplies without parachutes. Other times the chutes came down lowering fragile cargo, probably ammunition rather than food. And while there was a certain amount of trouble with military personnel shooting pigs and livestock belonging to the local villages, there were a lot of native workers employed in the Allied military campaign, and from the point of view of somebody who was perhaps having their first sight of an industrialised culture, let alone an industrialised culture at war, the sheer quantity of resources that the Allies were able to summon up to be disgorged from their cargo aircraft, the cornucopia of goodies had a sort of a mind-shattering effect. And at the end of the war, there were people who dreamed of enticing the great metal birds to return and shower precious cargo onto the highlands of New Guinea. And by the 1970s, some of them actually got organised enough to be led by veterans of the Papuan Infantry Brigade, which the Australians enlisted and trained in the whitefellas' way of warfare. But in the 1970s I first saw on television a documentary on how they were building roadside shrines with little wooden and cane aircraft held together with twine cut from banana leaves. And they weren't trying to recover the war and bring back the fighting and the devastation. They just wanted the precious cargo to come back. And it's taken 40 years, but finally the cargo cult mentality has landed again in Sydney, where Tony Abbott, the budgie smuggling wingnut's grand plan to try and pork barrel the New South Wales electorate of the Western Sydney suburbs is to give them an airport to play with, and that'll occupy them for 10 years, shifting dirt from one place to the other, and by the time they get their runways built and their roads built, there won't be enough fuel or tourists to occupy one runway at Bankstown, let alone Kingsford Smith. So out there at Badgery's Creek, what they're going to have is a white elephant full of empty pork barrels, a monument to Tony Abbott's cargo cult mentality. And it'll be a lasting indictment to the inability of the political and economic and merchant classes of Australia to get their heads around the fact that climate science is real and global warming is happening, and the extreme weather is dismantling the economies on which all these profit fantasies based on projected tourist movements are based. But anyway, that's what they're going to do. They're going to build a white elephant full of empty pork barrels in honour of Tony Abbott's cargo cult. Badgery's Creek Airport. Warbles on a lot to YouTube. Ciao.